We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the honourable member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Albanese Labor government is the weakest and most incompetent since the Whitlam government. The RBA forecasts that inflation will not return to the midpoint to the target for 2 years.
I want to hear the question before I hear I think I know where we're going with the point of order, but the descriptors which I used and illustrated yesterday, to be crystal clear with the chamber, is not within standing orders. So this is the first question since we've had this, and I said if there were descriptors, it's going to be a problem. So if we can just start the questions without the descriptors, it would assist the chamber greatly. The Manager of Opposition, a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, there is a distinction to be drawn between language about an individual and a fact-based assessment of the performance of a government.
Look, it places the chair in a really difficult position if we go down this path, and it is a slippery path, and we'll just race to the bottom. And I don't want question time to be like that. And I can understand that it's an opinion, but it is not helpful for, I think, the dignity of question time and the running of the parliament. Order. The Prime Minister will cease ejecting. On the point of order.
Mr Speaker, just to seek clarity from your earlier advice, I just need clarification as to what standing order it is that you might be relying on. The description of a government in these terms, as the Leader of Opposition Business pointed out, is quite distinct from a reflection on an individual member, which obviously is dealt with in the standing orders. But I do think it's difficult, with all due respect, to rule that an adequate description, as I think we've put here in this question, can be ruled out of order. I don't think it offends the standing orders at all. And if you can't describe a government in terms that it should be described in, I don't understand how it is that that we can have a breach of the standing orders.
Order. The member for Lyons. Order. Will do. I haven't said the question's out of order. I haven't ruled that way. No, I wasn't heading that way. I was just letting the House know my views. And I'm trying to assist the House so everyone gets a fair go. But I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. In terms of the issues just raised by the Leader of the Opposition, where he said, how could it be against the standing orders? Standing Order 100, subsection D, questions must not contain Part 2 arguments. Same Standing Order, subsection D, Part 3, questions must not contain inferences. Same Standing Order, subsection D, Part 4, imputations can't be contained. Same Standing Order 100, subsection D, 5, insults can't be included. You then go to Standing Order 101, Speaker's discretion about Standing Order 101A, that the Speaker may direct a member to change the language of a question asked during question time if the language is inappropriate or does not otherwise conform with the standing orders, and B, change the language of a question in writing if the language is inappropriate or does not otherwise conform with the standing orders. Mr Speaker, in terms...
everyone resume their seats. I'll deal with this. Yeah, the Leader of the House will finish his point of order and then we'll move on, and I'll deal with this. Don't worry.
I only rise because the Leader of the Opposition challenged to say where is this an offence to the standing orders. There's a myriad of examples.
Yeah. And no, we're going to get through this. Don't worry. Manager, just resume your seat for a moment. And I take the point from the manager, which is correct, and the Leader of the Opposition, which is correct also. The difficulty for the chair is, and this is not the first time this has risen, and it's not the first time in any parliament where descriptors have come into it. So I'll allow the question, but I'm just making the point to the House that we just need to be careful with the language that we're using on both sides with questions and answers, and this has come from the crossbench before and it's been raised. I understand the issue. I'm just advising the House, for everyone's benefit, if we could reframe language to be more factual and to be on point, I think question time would be a better thing. I give the call to the member for Hume.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Albanese Labor government is the weakest and most incompetent since the Whitlam government. The RBA forecasts that inflation will not return to the midpoint of the target for 2 years. When will this Prime Minister finally admit that Labor's reckless spending means inflation and interest rates are higher for longer?
Call to the Treasurer. Order.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm delighted that the member for Hume has asked me to make comparisons with previous governments, because when we came to office, inflation was much higher and rising, and now it's much lower and it's falling on our watch, Mr Speaker. And that's not by accident. That's because our policies are helping in the fight against inflation, a point that the Reserve Bank Governor has herself made when it comes to the 2 surpluses that we delivered. We turned 2 big Liberal deficits into 2 substantial Labor surpluses, and that's helping in the fight against inflation. And if he wants to compare this government to previous governments, then he should fess up that when this government came to office, real wages were falling by 3.4% and now they're growing again. He should fess up and say that when they left office, they left behind $1 trillion in Liberal debt and nowhere near enough to show for it, Mr Speaker. He should fess up while he's at it to all of the other comparisons that show that we are making welcome and encouraging progress in the fight against inflation and cleaning up the mess that we inherited from those opposite Mr Speaker. Now, he mentioned before the RBA's forecast for inflation, and he said that inflation doesn't get back to the midpoint of the target band for a couple of years. If he looked at the forecasts that were released yesterday, he'd see that the Reserve Bank has inflation returning to the midpoint of the target band in June. Not in 2 years, Mr Speaker, but in June. And if he was honest, Mr Speaker, he would say that what he's doing once again is deliberately trying to confuse people and trying to confuse the underlying measure and the headline measure. The Reserve Bank targets the headline measure, and they say in their new forecast that they'll hit the midpoint of the target band on the headline measure in June of 2025, and it'll be 2.6 in their estimation by the end of this year. And it's really good. It's really actually quite kind and quite generous and quite gracious of him to ask us about the RBA forecast, because if he was accurate about it, he would tell the House and the people who might be watching at home that right across the board the Reserve Bank actually lowered their forecast for inflation yesterday. In the new forecast that they released yesterday, they lowered their forecast for inflation this year from 3 to 2.6, June 2.8 to 2.5. They lowered their forecast for inflation. And if he wants to talk about underlying inflation, if he wants to be accurate, he would also fess up and say they downgraded their forecasts for underlying inflation as well, Mr Speaker. Now, this government understands that people are doing it tough, despite the fact that the headline and underlying inflation rates have been coming down in encouraging ways. We know that people are still doing it tough. The difference between this side of the House and that side is we want to do something about it, and we are.
Give the call to the member for Fraser.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Today, the people of the United States are voting for their next president. Why is this election important to Australia, and how will the government work with the new administration?
Order. The member for Longman, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, will cease objecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Fraser for his question. And of course, the election of a new President of the United States is always a moment of profound consequence for the world, for our region and for Australia. Our government will seek and build a strong partnership with whoever the American people choose as their next president. The alliance between Australia and the United States has always been bigger than individuals. It has stood tall through generations of governments from both sides of the aisle, and we will work together as allies.
The Prime Minister reports the member for Barker is warned and will not be interjecting for the remainder of question time. This constant conversation and commentary is enough. No more. Prime Minister has the call.
Of course, as leader of the Labor Party, I'm proud that it was John Curtin who looked to America in Australia's darkest hours during World War II. And since that occurred, the US alliance has grown and it's prospered under Labor and Liberal governments, under Democrat and Republican administrations. Over many decades and throughout many global challenges, we've always sought to work together to advance our shared interests, and I have every confidence that we'll continue to do so. I do want to take the opportunity to pay tribute to my friend President Joe Biden. Within 48 hours of being sworn in as PM, I was meeting with President Biden at the Quad meeting in Tokyo. It was a whirlwind, but I'll never forget the genuine warmth of Joe's welcome. We've worked together very closely to make Australia's alliance with the United States stronger than it has ever been, working together not just in AUKUS and defence issues, but also on taking action against climate change, also on areas such as critical minerals as well. I look forward to deepening that cooperation even further at APEC and the G20, which will commence next week and then the week after. We have made great progress on trade and on technology, on climate, on all of these issues, working together with our friends in the region as well to promote stability, security and prosperity. Though President Biden has several months left in his presidency, I do want to acknowledge his lifetime of service to the American people. His has been an extraordinary contribution. First elected to the Senate in 1972, Joe Biden has been a powerful advocate for working people, for the cause of democracy and for peace. He has also been someone who has a deep interest in the Asia-Pacific region, and under his presidency there certainly has been a pivot to this region. It has been an honour to work with him, and I look forward to catching up with him yet again. He gave me the honour of welcoming me into his home just weeks ago. I look forward to catching up with him in those important global summits coming up.
Call on indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Excuse me. Just on indulgence, Mr Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his words and echo his words in relation to President Biden, who's been a very strong friend with Australia for a long period of time. I met with him in New York a couple of years ago now, and his dedication to the relationship and to the strengthening of our bilateral relations, particularly in relation to defence, is well known to all in this place. When the Coalition negotiated AUKUS with the United States and the United Kingdom, it was in our mutual and collective best interests, particularly in an uncertain time. And so all Australians, like many people across the world, are looking at the moment to see what the results might be over the coming hours. Whatever the outcome, we know that for our relationship with the United States, it will endure, it will strengthen, and we will make sure that we work very closely with the incoming administration, and obviously the period between November and January is important, as the Prime Minister points out, and Ambassador Rudd, of course, will be working day and night to establish those links and ties and deepen relationships and start new ones. That will be his job over the next few months, I'm sure. But most importantly, we want to see a safe environment in which people can vote, and we want to see the best outcome for the United States, because when our close ally is strong and at its best, the world is in its best possible position.
The call is non-member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Albanese Labor government is the weakest and most incompetent since the Whitlam government. Yesterday, the RBA Governor said, and I quote, "The underlying inflation that we're experiencing is still sitting at around 5% for services. That's still a significant amount of inflation in the system."
Member will resume her seat for a moment, and she will return back to her question. The Deputy Leader of the House.
We have had this discussion, as the Leader of the Opposition points out, and Mr Speaker, you made very clear the view that questions should not contain argument, imputation and various other things that are prohibited under the standing orders. You would have thought that the Manager of Opposition Business would have got the message and reworded the question. Given that they haven't, I ask that you ask the member to reword her question and ask it again.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. The Manager on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, first of all, you've already ruled on this, but secondly, this is particularly rich coming from the Deputy Leader of the House, who makes an art form of answering questions which include the phrase wasted decade.
Not commentary on someone. What is your point of order?
Monopoly on virtue on this side of the House.
Yeah, I've dealt with this issue, and I would have thought, out of respect for the Speaker, you might have taken on board what I said, but that hasn't happened. So the member for Flinders will state a question again.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the RBA Governor said, and I quote, "The underlying inflation that we're experiencing is still sitting at around 5% for services. That's still a significant amount of inflation in the system." When will this Prime Minister finally admit that Labor's reckless spending means inflation and interest rates are higher for longer?
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her revised question. And I point out that services inflation in Australia is lower than it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. I also refer to the Governor's statements that she made just yesterday. She said this: "I've said public demand is not the main game. We still have inflation coming back to target in a reasonable way." That's what she said. She then went on to make other comments as well. She spoke about we did take a different path to some other countries. Some other countries went up much higher, much more restrictive. Some of those countries, Canada and New Zealand, for example, are finding their unemployment rate rising quite quickly. She also went on to say at her press conference the fact that inflation now for the last year has only been 2.8% is actually real for people. They are seeing lower petrol prices, they are seeing lower electricity prices, so this is good for people. Real incomes are rising again. As inflation is declining and wage growth is a bit higher than that, and you've got the tax cuts, real incomes are rising again. That is what Governor Bullock had to say yesterday. Those opposite speak about spending in their arrogant and reckless way. And have a look at what the criticism is for their $315 billion that they say is wasteful spending. Will they cut the indexation of the age pension, $14 billion? Would they cut energy bill relief for households and businesses? Was that all wasteful? We know they opposed it. Cheaper childcare for families and a 15% pay rise for early childhood educators. Expanding paid parental leave to 6 months and paying super on PPL. Is that waste? Increases to Commonwealth rent assistance. We know they didn't really like that, and they certainly didn't like expanding eligibility for parenting payments single. We know that they find fee-free TAFE offensive. Indeed, for a bloke who's been in the parliament for 20 years, yesterday was the first time that the Leader of the Opposition has mentioned the word TAFE. In 20 years in the parliament, the first time he has mentioned the word TAFE. The boosting and indexing job seeker payments waste. The cheaper medicines, we know that they oppose that as well. And we know that they want to abolish the Housing Australia Future Fund and make $19 billion of cuts to housing. Now, that's not a way forward. What we've managed to do is to halve inflation while looking after people through cost of living relief.
Call to the honourable member for Dunkley.
My question is to the Treasurer. Why is it so important we ease cost of living measures for Australians, especially younger Australians, and what alternatives are there?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the wonderful member for Dunkley for her question. I wanted to read for the House, Mr Speaker, some comments from the Sydney Morning Herald editorial today, which said this: "Young people are becoming increasingly sensitive to the prospect of finishing tertiary studies with a crippling level of debt. There's a real danger that many capable school leavers will be discouraged from pursuing further education, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Policies that limit the debt burden on young Australians are a worthwhile investment in our future." Now, we couldn't agree more, Mr Speaker, and that's why this side of the House is for lower student debt and that side of the House is for higher student debt. Now, we want to make sure that we're supporting young people and people with a student debt where we can do that in a responsible and affordable way. And that's why we're making fee-free TAFE a permanent feature of the system. It's why we're changing the indexation of student debt. It's why we're making it so that you have to earn more before you start paying it back. It's why we're slashing student debt by 20%, Mr Speaker. And when you put that together with the steps that we took to make sure that young people get a proper tax cut, and you put that together with what we're doing on wages and housing and rent assistance, this is all about ensuring that Australians, and particularly young Australians, earn more and keep more of what they earn, and that we get prices in our economy under control, Mr Speaker. Now, as I said before, those opposite don't want us to help young people. They don't want to help people with their student debt. They can always find room in their budgets for waste and rorts, but they can never find room to help people who are genuinely doing it tough. And this does go to a big difference at the election and in this parliament in the interim, Mr Speaker. We want to slash, and we are slashing student debt, and we're slashing inflation. Those opposite want to slash Medicare, they want to slash investment in housing, and that will make life harder for people, Mr Speaker. The last time they were in government, they gave us much more public debt, and now in opposition they want to give young people much more student debt. Now, we've spent a big part of our time in office cleaning up the mess that they left behind, Mr Speaker, and not for its own reason, not as an end in itself, but so we can afford to help young people who are doing it tough. Now, when we gave a tax cut to every taxpayer, they said it was too broad. They said it helped too many people. They wanted an election over that. Now, when we want to help young people, they say it's too narrow. It's too narrow. They need to make up their mind, Mr Speaker. This government under this Prime Minister has found a way to repair the budget and help people with the cost of living. They find excuse after excuse to do neither of those things, Mr Speaker. The progress that we're making on student debt is at risk if those opposite are elected. This is one of the many costs of the risky and reckless arrogance of this opposition leader, long on risky arrogance and short on economic credibility. We see that time and time again.
Treasurer's time has concluded. Before I call the member for Curtin, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today are the 3 winners from this year's My First Speech competition: Taylor Harding, Anna Mackie, Sophia Tong from the electorates of Hughes, Moore and Parramatta. Welcome to Question Time and congratulations on some brilliant speeches. And I give the call to the member for Curtin.
This is a question for the Prime Minister. Today's US election reminds us how fragile democracy is. Australia is not immune to the mistrust we see in the US. There's increasing suspicion that politicians are acting in the interests of airlines, fossil fuels or gambling companies, unions or a political party instead of all Australians. Voters deserve to know who is funding all political candidates before they vote. Will the government legislate real-time donation disclosure in time to make our next federal election transparent?
No. If anyone thinks that was acceptable, particularly members on my left, yelling out while the member was asking her questions with snide remarks, you haven't been paying attention. Unbelievable. The member is entitled to ask her question without comments, without remarks. You mightn't like what a member is saying, but that's the nature of question time. I don't like it either. So the member will begin her question again, and we're going to keep resetting this until we get it right. Member for Curtin has the call.
This is a question for the Prime Minister. Today's US election reminds us how fragile democracy is. Australia is not immune to the mistrust that we see in the US. There's increasing suspicion that politicians are acting in the interests of airlines, fossil fuel or gambling companies, unions or a political party instead of all Australians. Voters deserve to know who is funding all political candidates before they vote. Will the government legislate real-time donation disclosure in time to make our next federal election transparent?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Curtin for her question. And indeed, democracy is something that must be cherished and must be nurtured and cannot be taken for granted. We see in many surveys around the world that younger people in particular, when asked about different political systems, don't necessarily automatically go towards democracy. And it is why we have to have a transparent system. And I can confirm that I have been working as the leader of a government to increase transparency, including on funding issues. And indeed, I met just this morning, had another constructive discussion with the Minister for the Special Minister of State, Senator Farrell, about these issues. We believe in lower donation thresholds and have done that and took that to an election for a long period of time. We believe that the abuse that we've seen, to name someone, not picking on him, but the contribution that Clive Palmer made to donations is something that distorts the political system. And we think that something must be done about that to make sure that we continue to have a political system in which we encourage people to participate, including through political parties and their membership. But we are working through those things. As you're aware, as a member of the crossbench, some of the crossbench and their supporters have had very strong views about the timing of changes that come through, and they haven't been consistent, it must be said, with the view just put by the member for Curtin. Certainly some of the backers of people who've been independent candidates have expressed the opposite view, to be very clear, that the member for Curtin has put forward. But what we will do is continue to work through with the parliament. We want to make sure that there's increased transparency. We want to make sure that there's increased trust as well in the political system. That is one of the reasons why I've been so determined to make a difference, which is practical, in order to ensure that people aren't left behind by the political system. That's something that drives our policy agenda. It's one of the reasons why we made the announcements we did on Sunday, because people feel like they haven't got enough of a voice, particularly young people in our political system. But we'll work through it, both in terms of electoral issues, but on policy issues as well, to make sure that people understand that our democracy works for them.
Time has concluded. Call to the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to build a better and fairer education system, and what has been the response?
The call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank my friend, the legendary member for Lalor, for her question. Mr Speaker, big things are happening in education.
Order.
On Monday, the 15% pay rise for early educators was passed through this House. Today in Parliament we're debating legislation to increase funding for our public schools. And on the weekend we announced that if we win the next election, the first piece of legislation that we will introduce will cut student debt by 20%. All of this is about making our education system better and fairer. Our early educators do some of the most important work in this country, but you wouldn't know that from what they're paid. The 15% pay rise that this Prime Minister has made happen fixes that. and the first part of that pay rise rolls out in just 25 days' time. The increased funding for our public schools is critical to make sure that we turn around the drop in the number of young people finishing high school and help young people when they're very, very young in primary school who fall behind to catch up and to keep up. And as I said yesterday, the fact is that university is more expensive today than when most of us were there. When HECS was first created, students paid about 24% of the cost of a degree. Under John Howard, this increased to about 36%. Under Scott Morrison, this increased again to almost 45%. We are cutting the debt for 3 million Australians who were hurt by these Liberal changes. For someone with an average debt, we're cutting it by $5,500. And what does the Liberal Party say about this? They say that this is terrible, quote-unquote terrible. They say this is a terrible thing to do. Well, Mr Speaker, I was contacted this week by the architect of HECS, Professor Bruce Chapman, and this is what he said. It is generally and correctly believed that the overall level of HECS help debt has become excessive, and that in this context a one-off 20% cut in the level of debts is welcome. Welcome. And I suspect that's what the 20,000 people in the electorate of Herbert will say as well, and the almost 21,000 people in the opposition leader's electorate will say as well, and the 23,000 people in the electorate of Ford, or, Mr Speaker, the 25,000 people in your electorate as well, or the almost 26,000 people in the electorate of Sturt, because they now know that if Labor wins, they win. That if the Liberals win, if the Grinches over there win, then they know they won't.
Order. The member for Hume has the call.
Treasurer, the Albanese Labor government is the weakest and most incompetent since Whitlam. Yesterday, the RBA governor said, when I speak to the Treasurer, he is fully aware—
We're going to deal with this issue once and for all. I have now checked my records and I want to make a statement to the House. We've dealt with this before. I want to just go through the House about where we're at with this issue, because I'm relying on former Speaker's advice and what they have said to the House on this matter as well. Speaker Andrew probably gave the most comprehensive description of improper motives at the beginning, middle and end of questions, as highlighted on page 556 of practice, and noted the attitude to intervene when the attribution of motive was such that it cannot be ignored. Speaker Smith ruled on 2 occasions, and I want to read some of his statements about this descriptor coming in, which will then be used as a tag. And on 2 occasions he ruled that part of the question out of order. That was on the 15th of February 2021 and the 4th of December 2018. Speaker Smith said in relation to this issue being raised, "I'm certainly not comfortable with the language that just makes assertions as it did. I'm really not. And those on my left, the then opposition, wouldn't be comfortable if that sort of language was directed back at them." We don't need commentary from those on my right either. Language shouldn't be in question. So I'm following the practice and the precedent of 2 former speakers here. So I'm just going to ask the member. Now, on that occasion, both occasions, Speaker Smith just ruled the questions out of order. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to invite the member, as is my practice, to make sure every question remains within the standing orders, just to remove that part of the question and begin his question again. No, you can't make a comment. No, you can't make a comment. Do you wish to make a point of order?
You to reflect then on every question the Teal party asked, who, as that previous question did, had a lot of influence on people in this chamber.
And on order, and thank you for I thank the member for Page for raising that as a point of order, because I've taken that approach also with members of the crossbench. And if you'd like to check the records, on the 12th of February 2024, on the 14th of February 2023, on the 20th of March 2024 with cross-bench questions, I did, and in other examples, invite them to rephrase the question. Yes, on a point of order, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My point of order is to seek clarification from you as to whether or not it is your ruling that using the description of the word weakest as a description of the government and using the description the most incompetent government, that you are ruling that that is not in order and that you would rule a question out of order if it was to be included as a description of the Albanese government as a preamble or as part of the question at the end of the question being asked of the government.
On the point of order.
Just to the point of order, Mr Speaker, just to draw the attention of the House to the difference between the restricted rules that are there under standing orders for questions, where there are other terms that would not otherwise be unparliamentary but cannot be included in questions, which is exactly what that ruling goes to.
That's correct. And I certainly, if that is used as language during question time or that is being used, of course would allow that. But when it comes to the questions, I'm following the precedent and examples that I've used in question time and that former speakers have used as well. So to assist the House, if we can rephrase the question so that we can keep moving forward with question time, so everyone's question can be asked and answered, it would greatly assist the House, just as I've done before and in line with former speakers, to ensure that we can ask the question without the imputation added to it. And I give the call to the member for Hume.
Mr Speaker, I thank you for your advice. I do seek a ruling under the standing orders in relation to this matter because I don't believe that there is a case here to be made that using the words weakest and the most incompetent government since the Whitlam government are offending the standing orders. And I don't believe it's in order for a ruling on that basis to be made. Now, I'm very happy to assist you, of course, in the orderly conduct of the chamber, but the opposition can't be put into a position where we can't describe the government as we believe they should be described. It's not a personal reflection on the Prime Minister. It's not an inference. It's not an allegation. It is a description.
Order.
It is a description of the government, and I can recall many instances against the Howard government, against the Rudd government, against the Gillard government, where similar language was used and on subsequent occasions ruled in order by the Speaker of the day. And if it is the position that you believe it is, that you require us to take this course of action, then I'm asking under the standing orders that you make clear that this is a ruling. That this is a ruling?
Yeah, I've already made my decision the last time this was made, and I really want question time to continue, as I'm sure all members do. Order. The Prime Minister will cease interjecting. So I give the call to the member for Hume.
Treasurer, the Albanese government is the weakest and most incompetent since the Whitlam government. Yesterday, the RBA governor said, when I speak to the Treasurer, he is fully aware of the inflationary implications of his policies. He needs to think about that. Does this Treasurer accept the Governor's claim?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, in the last minute or two we got the perfect illustration of the reckless arrogance of the opposition leader and the comical cluelessness of the Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker. In one little vignette in question time, all the reckless arrogance from this guy and all the comical cluelessness from his offsider who sits behind him, Mr Speaker.
The Treasurer is just going to return to the question. Order. The Treasurer is just going to return to the question.
Mr Speaker, the point that the Reserve Bank Governor made yesterday, which I welcome, because it is 100% consistent with the point that I've made on a number of occasions, is that my major focus, this government's major focus, is the fight against inflation. And that's what Governor Bullock said yesterday. Governor Bullock acknowledged again that my main focus and our main focus is fighting inflation, and she said, in a way that I'm perfectly comfortable with, that when I talk privately with the Governor of the Reserve Bank, I make it clear that inflation is our highest priority. Now, that's not the only point that Governor Bullock made yesterday. She made three major points. That was one of them. Another major point that she made was she reminded those opposite and the country more broadly that when it comes to inflation, that public demand is not the main game. She said that again yesterday. And the third important point that was made yesterday by the Governor in her press conference and in her statement is that inflation has fallen substantially from its peaks in 2022 and it's coming back to target in a reasonable way, Mr Speaker. Another good point made by the Reserve Bank Governor. Now, Mr Speaker, if the Shadow Treasurer wants to be accurate, it would be the first time, but if he wants to be accurate, then he should acknowledge in this place that the Reserve Bank yesterday released new forecasts for inflation where they lowered their forecasts for inflation. Inflation is already back in the target band for the first time since 2021, and the Reserve Bank made it clear with their new forecasts that they expect inflation to be lower than what they had earlier anticipated. And not just in a headline sense, Mr Speaker, but also when it comes to underlying inflation. Now, I say to the Shadow Treasurer, who appears to be chirping away in some kind of an incoherent way from over there, I say to the Shadow Treasurer that if he's dark about inflation at 2.8%, he must have been absolutely furious when he was in office and inflation was 6.1%. Because most people in Australia understand, even if the Shadow Treasurer doesn't, that 2.8 is smaller than 6.1. And inflation's a bit like golf, Mr Speaker. You want a lower number. You want a lower number, not a higher number. When we came to office, inflation was more than double what it is now. It was much higher and rising. Now it is lower and falling, and that's because, as the Reserve Bank Governor has rightly acknowledged in her comments yesterday, the fight against inflation is our #1 priority.
Call to the member for Reid.
My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government supporting young Australians by cutting student debt and making free TAFE permanent?
Call to the Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for Reid for her question and for the magnificent representation she gives to my neighbours in the electorate next door to mine. And on Sunday we made three important announcements. Firstly, that we would change the thresholds in which students have to pay back their debt under the HEC scheme, as it was called, now under those opposite seeing just as like a loan scheme that doesn't invest in Australians. But by increasing that from $54,000 to $67,000, it will make an enormous difference, putting extra dollars back into the pockets of graduates. Secondly, a 20% cut in student debt across the board. So whether you have a debt that comes from a university degree or a TAFE qualification, you will get that support, meaning that for the average graduate it's worth about $5,500 to them, making an enormous difference to them. And the third element is making free TAFE permanent. 100,000 places each and every year. And importantly, the first round of free TAFE came out of the Jobs and Skills Summit. It's something that we consulted employers and business community, unions and civil society who understood that we have skills shortages in our economy, and our first priority should be to train Australians for those opportunities. When you put together those three measures, this is about Labor's core belief that education is the key to creating opportunity, widening those doors of opportunity so that people can be backed for a better life. Now, I do want to say that when it comes to TAFE, those opposite have always been arrogant in their view of public TAFE. They've called it a waste. They bag it in opposition, they cut it in government. They always look for TAFE to fail, and as I said before, the last time the Leader of the Opposition mentioned TAFE in Parliament was 2004. He's gone 20 years without mentioning it at all. Well, on this side of the House we've always backed TAFE. And I want to say to every single person enrolled in TAFE, we back you too. Whether you're a young Australian embarking on your first career or an apprenticeship, or whether you be an older worker who's retraining to fit the needs of the new economy. We want you to get that qualification, get that job and build the life that you want. This government supports your aspiration. This government supports your education. And this government will continue to back you regardless of those opposite.
Concluded. Call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. The Albanese Labor government is the weakest and most incompetent since the Whitlam government. Minister, of the 500,000 enrolments in fee-free TAFE since Labor was elected, funded with $1.5 billion of taxpayer funds, how many have resulted in no qualification being delivered?
Call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Thanks, Speaker. And I'm really pleased to get another question from the Shadow Minister on TAFE, and completion.
Members on my left.
And I really hope these questions continue. Every day, Speaker, students are enrolling in fee-free TAFE. And what I want to emphasise is that good courses and advanced TAFE study takes time. And I also want to say this, as the Shadow Minister I'm sure knows, the Professional Data Agency, the custodian, the NCVR, reports completions after 4 years. The vet data experts only report on a cohort that it completes after 4 years, because it takes 4 years to get usable data. It takes 4 years because the learning is complex and critical. It takes 4 years because TAFE courses are just as important as university degrees. It takes 4 years, 4 years because 4 out of 5 students are enrolled part-time. It takes 4 years. It takes 4 years because someone who enrolled yesterday, Speaker and members opposite, can't complete today. I would have thought that's a pretty simple concept.
Members on my left.
The latest NCV publication covers enrolments from 2019. That completion data from 2023 or 2024 will be reported by the custodian in 2027. So drawing conclusions on this year's data and last year's data simply doesn't make sense. Like pretty much everything the Shadow Minister says. Students are still completing their studies. Students are starting their studies. Now, fee-free TAFE has been operating in Victoria since 2019, Speaker, so there is 4 years of data there, and maybe the Shadow Minister and members opposite might want to have regard to that. The NCVER there shows that free TAFE completions are higher than university. They are also higher than the vet system more generally. What the evidence says from Victoria, from the data custodian, is that free TAFE is doing its job. 508,000 Australians agree. Why doesn't the opposition?
Order. Give the Leader of the Opposition. We're not doing anything until the House comes to order. The Minister for Infrastructure, I've just said we're not doing anything until the House comes to order, and you're interjecting. We shall hear from the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How are the Albanese Labor government's investments in Medicare making it easier to see a bulk billing doctor? And why is it needed after a decade of cuts and neglect?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you to the member for Bendigo for that question. When we came to government after a decade of cuts and neglect, bulk billing was in free fall and it was really hard to come across a doctor. And that's why the member for Bendigo and the rest of the Labor team made such a clear commitment to strengthen Medicare, Mr Speaker. And I'm pleased to report that our record investments in Medicare now mean we have more doctors, more bulk billing, and we're opening more Medicare urgent care clinics. On doctors, Mr Speaker, in the past 2 years we've seen the biggest increase in the number of doctors in Australia in a decade, and I'm particularly pleased that the number of junior doctors choosing general practice training is up by 25%. And, Mr Speaker, it's 12 months now since our record investments in bulk billing took effect, the tripling of the bulk billing incentive. Bulk billing had been in freefall, to use the words of the College of GPs. So the first and most important objective of our investments was to stop the slide. And for a Labor government, that was absolutely critical. Maybe not for the Leader of the Opposition, who famously said there were too many free Medicare services, but for Labor, bulk billing is the beating heart of Medicare. And, Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to report we have stopped the slide. But more than that, we've seen a rebound in bulk billing in every single state and territory. In the seat of Bendigo, bulk billing is up by more than 8%, thanks to the energetic promotion of our investments by the local member. And across the country, in just 12 months, there have been 5.4 million additional free visits to the GP, 40% of them in rural Australia. And at the same time as that, Mr Speaker, almost 900,000 Australians have been seen at our Medicare urgent care clinics, every single one of them fully bulk billed. Now, we know, Mr Speaker, that Medicare is still under very serious pressure and there is still much more for us to do, but these investments are making a real difference. More doctors, more bulk billing, more urgent care clinics. But we also know that that progress is under serious threat from those opposite, a reckless opposition. The Shadow Treasurer has made it clear that our additional investments in bulk billing and the rest are on the chopping block if they win government. No more support for bulk billing. The urgent care clinics are going to close. And you just have to look at the Leader of the Opposition's record to see that he has form in this area. We remember when he was Health Minister, he tried to abolish bulk billing altogether. He tried to cut $50 billion from our hard-working public hospitals. And just imagine, Speaker, how bad things will be if he ever gets his hands on Medicare again.
I didn't want to interrupt the minister during his answer. The member for Fisher, under my calculations, was up to about 13 interjections in one answer, continuously. So he's going to leave the chamber under 94A. Doesn't matter what time a question, when it is in question time. If someone's just going to continually yell during question time, they weren't going to be here for the remainder of it. The Manager of Opposition on a point of order. Oh, on a question.
My question is to the Minister for Health and Ageing. Can the minister confirm that under the Coalition the bulk billing rate was 88% compared to 74% under Labor?
Order. Minister for Health and Aged Care has the floor.
Well, I'm asked about the former government's record on bulk billing, and I am very pleased to talk about the record of bulk billing because it is clear that as the former government was ending their time in government, as we came to government, bulk billing was in free fall. And I don't make up that word. That was a description.
Order.
That was the description used by the then President of the College of General Practitioners. The then President of the College of General Practitioners. And really, it should be of no surprise. The Leader of the Opposition, when he was Health Minister, when he couldn't abolish bulk billing altogether, started a freeze on the Medicare rebate that endured for 6 long years.
All right, the minister's going to pause his 1 minute, less than 1 minute in, but it was a pretty tight question on facts and figures. It was about bulk billing rates, but we're going to hear from the member for Hume. When I'm dealing with a point of order, I'm asking you to help me to help the chamber. Great. The Manager of Opposition on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, a very tight question. The bulk billing rate was 84% under the Coalition, 74% under Labor. We're not after rhetorical flourishes and equivocation. We're after the number. If you can't give it, he should simply sit down.
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, just adding to what was just said there by the Manager of Opposition Business, therefore, to be directly relevant, it is relevant for the minister to refer to bulk billing under the coalition and what happened then, and bulk billing under this government.
Order. Okay. Everyone, just cool it. You're asking a question about figures and you're asking about billing rates, about the former government and this government. Obviously, there's figures involved and there's a comparison involved of, I don't know where the figures have come from or sourced. Order. The member for Braddon. So I'm just going to make sure the minister is directly relevant. He's got to keep to the subject that he was asked about, not stray into any other policies than bulk billing rates.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The figure that the Manager of Opposition Business uses also includes, as I understand it, stand to be corrected, but also includes COVID vaccinations and consults for COVID vaccinations, which did artificially boost the bulk billing rate. Now, we've been very clear.
Order.
We've been very clear.
Order.
We've been very clear that our interest was in the bulk billing rates for GP consults. Well, I hear all the interjections. They might not be interested in the bulk billing rate for GP consults, but that was the basis on which we started reporting bulk billing data, because GP colleges and the rest of the representatives said they could not tell from the data published by the former government what the bulk billing rate was for GP visits. And GP visits are the core service in the Medicare system. So two things. The former government did not include transparent data on bulk billing. They artificially inflated it with COVID vaccinations and the rest. The second thing is the trajectory was clear. But I'll say this, in winding up, Mr Speaker, I am happy any day of the week to have a debate on bulk billing with this man, the worst health minister in the history of Medicare. And I don't say that as an opinion. That was the opinion of Australia's doctors. Australia's doctors. And the second worst health minister in the history of Medicare was the deputy leader of the Liberal Party, because she froze the Medicare rebate for her entire time as health minister. Under this Treasurer, the Medicare rebate has increased in 2 years by more than the former government managed in nine.
Order.
In 9
Leader of the
long
Opposition.
years.
The member for Gilmore has the call. Order. Order. No, the Minister for Health and the Leader of the Opposition are going to cease interjecting. The member for Gilmore just resumed her seat. The Treasurer is now warned. I'm sure people want to continue with question time. So now that everyone is not interjecting, the House has come to order. We'll hear from the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. How is the Albanese Labor government delivering for farmers and producers through its diligent work to repair and strengthen trade relationships? How does this differ from other approaches?
The call to the Minister for Small Business, the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And I do want to thank our terrific member for Gilmore, because she supports our farmers and producers in regional Australia like the people on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, because we're delivering for farmers, producers, businesses and workers through repairing our trading relationships. We're strengthening our international relationships, Mr Speaker. I've just come from the signing with Ministers Wong and Farrell, the signing between Australia and the United Arab Emirates, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And it was a real privilege to sign on behalf of our government the Memorandum of Understanding in relation to agriculture. Now, this is a significant win for Australian farmers, Mr Speaker. It will promote investment in supply chains and help producers and processors to diversify and create value-added products here in Australia. Indeed, the agreement will eliminate tariffs on over 99% of Australian exports to the UAE by value, including significant agricultural commodities such as meat, dairy, grains and oilseeds, pulses, horticulture and honey. The tariff savings alone are worth over $50 million a year to Australian agriculture. Under the MOU, Australia and the UAE will also encourage and facilitate investment in projects that support sustainable agriculture and food production through best practice land management, greenhouse gas emissions reduction and the development of climate-smart technologies and practices, Mr Speaker. And of course this comes just weeks after our government agreed to a timetable with China for the full resumption of Australian live rock lobster exports by the end of the year. When we came to government, Mr Speaker, we inherited $20 billion worth of trade impediments with our largest trading partner, China. This was a fractured relationship because the Liberals and the Nationals got it that way. But after our government's hard work, in the month of August alone, Australia exported $1.34 billion of previously affected goods to China. That is incredibly significant, Mr Speaker. Indeed, last year Australia exported over 70% of our agriculture, fisheries and forestry production to 169 markets globally. This is the most diversified our agricultural trade has ever been, the most it has ever been, and that is thanks to our government's hard work. We're busy cleaning up the mess left to us by those opposite. We know that the Leader opposition, the Liberals and the Nationals, are a risk, and their reckless arrogance is a risk to, of course, our trade with our partners because of the way they behaved in government. It's only the Albanese Labor government that is backing Australian farmers and producers with their exports because we back Australian jobs right across the country.
Call to the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. At a recent deliberative democracy forum on affordability and access to early childhood education and care in my electorate of North Sydney, the participants unanimously agreed that the childcare subsidy activity test should be abolished. This has also been recommended by the Productivity Commission and a number of other expert bodies. With the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook around the corner and a budget next March, will the government abolish the activity test, and if not, why not?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for North Sydney for her characteristically thoughtful question about the activity test. Whether it's this Prime Minister or Minister Ali, Minister Clare, the whole Cabinet, the whole government, we are big believers in the social and economic value of early childhood education and care. We see it as a game changer for families and for the economy more broadly as well. As you know, because the colleagues have made it clear, we are considering a whole range of possible reforms as part of our commitment to try and get the system as close as we can to something which is a bit more universal. And because of the work that was provided to us by the Productivity Commission and because of suggestions that we get from stakeholders, including the sorts of groups that you met with as part of your job in North Sydney, we are looking at all of those sorts of options. As it turns out, I met with the head of the Productivity Commission this morning, and we welcome the important work that they've provided us. I think, to be fair, early childhood education and care has been at the very core of our agenda really since we came to office. The biggest new investment in our first budget, all the way back in October of 2022, was our investment in cheaper childcare, Mr Speaker. And that meant that we lifted the subsidy to 90% for families earning up to $80,000 and benefiting 1.2 million families, and we're very proud of that. And as part of that reform package, the honourable member would recall that we made some modest changes to the activity test as well. We're also delivering a 15% pay rise for our early childhood educators, and that's because we value the work that they do, and we know to do that important work requires from us decent pay and decent conditions, and we're very proud to be providing substantial funding for that as well. I think up to 200,000 educators will benefit from that investment. We're very proud of that, as I said. More broadly, we're coming at the cost of living challenge from every conceivable, every responsible angle. Working parents were a big motivation for the tax cuts that the Prime Minister and I announced and which came in the middle of the year. We wanted to make sure that working families got a bigger tax cut, and particularly mums and particularly Australian women. 90% of women taxpayers are now getting a bigger tax cut than they would have under those opposite. 97% of early childhood educators are getting a bigger tax cut as well. So this is all about recognising that, making it easier for people to earn more, keep more of what they earn, work more if they want to, have more kids if they want to. These are really central priorities of this Prime Minister and this government. We know that the member for North Sydney shares our objectives here. We look forward to discussing these really important issues in more detail in time.
Call to the honourable member for Paterson.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. What policies are bringing energy costs down, and what policies will push energy costs up?
Order. Members on my left. It's far too many interjections. The Minister for Agriculture is not helping either. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the question. And policies that put energy prices down are energy bill relief, Mr Speaker, the policies of the Albanese government, and policies to introduce more and cheaper renewable energy. And we're seeing that, Mr Speaker, in the inflation figures this week. Last week we saw, Mr Speaker, the inflation figures which saw electricity prices fall 17.3% in the September quarter and 15.8% over the 12 months. News that you would think all honourable members would welcome, Mr Speaker. And we're seeing it in the medium term with wholesale energy prices. When we came to office, on the day we came to office, wholesale energy was $286 a megawatt hour, Mr Speaker. The average for this month so far is $67 a megawatt hour. Now, these are the policies that are putting energy prices down. Now, my honourable friend asked me what policies push energy prices up, and I think most of the House has a pretty good idea of what they might be, Mr Speaker. The policies of the opposition to introduce nuclear energy. Now, in the search for international examples to back the opposition's policy, the opposition and the Leader of the Opposition have focused on Ontario in Canada. On 50 occasions, the Leader of the Opposition has talked about Ontario. 50 times he's mentioned Ontario. Now, last week we heard from Professor Mark Winfield of York University in Ontario, the third biggest university in Canada, and he said, and I quote, "The Australian opposition leader seems to be operating on a very limited understanding of the history and current state of electricity, energy and climate policy in Ontario." He went on to point out that the nuclear policy had bankrupted Ontario Hydro and left Ontario taxpayers with $21 billion of debt. Now, what did the opposition have to say about this? About the province that the Leader of the Opposition had mentioned and cited 50 times? Our old friend, the member for Fairfax, said, and I quote, "Oh, it's an isolated example." An isolated example, Mr Speaker, was the member for Fairfax. So who do we believe? The Leader of the Opposition or an expert from the University of Ontario? The Leader of the Opposition who makes things up. He said nuclear power plants will produce one Coke can's worth of waste a year. It's 12,500. And more recently, he's been out again. He said last week, and I quote, "It's why the Labor in France is signing up for more nuclear. It's why Labor in Canada is signing up for more nuclear." France and Canada don't have Labor parties, Mr Speaker. And he said that He said in France the Labor government is strongly supportive of nuclear. The fact that they're a Labor government will come as quite a surprise to President Macron and Prime Minister Barnier, Mr Speaker. That's not how they see themselves. And they say they care about cost of living. The Leader of the Opposition has written a personal letter to thousands of Australians, Mr Speaker, about his nuclear policy, mainly older Australians, pensioners. I've had pensioners coming up to me saying it's a scam, and I said, yes, it is, but it's a real letter. And what's that letter asked for? Cash, Mr Speaker. Donations from pensioners, Mr Speaker, for the Liberal Party. That's their big agenda for Australia. They're going to need a lot more than fundraising letters to pay for their nuclear policy.
Order. Prime Minister has the call. Order. Prime Minister has the call. Order. Member for Ibae will resume the seat. The Minister for Climate Change is warned. And the member for O'Connor is now warned. Prime Minister has the call.
I ask further questions to be placed in the notice paper.
Order. The member for Warringah has indicated, and the member for Warringah has indicated she's seeking the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I have been misrepresented.
Do you claim to be misrepresented?
Thank you. Yes, Mr Speaker, with a number of members on the crossbench. The member for Hogan made an allegation of a teal party. Now, I know he may not be in his practice to read legislation.
No, we are going to do this just like every other member without commentary from the left and right. Okay? So we're just going to show everyone a deal of respect, just as if anyone else was rising. It doesn't matter what the person saying about it, they are entitled to do it under standing orders. So the member for Warringah has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Apologies. It's a member for Page who made a misrepresentation earlier during question time indicating members of the Teal Party. Of course, anyone who has read legislation will know there is no such thing, and our communities deserve the respect of their choice to be independently represented.
The Minister for Health has indicated he is seeking to add to an answer.
Thank you, Speaker. I seek to add to my answer in relation to bulk billing and the 88% figure used by the Manager of Opposition Business. And I refer to statements by the Vice President of the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners in August 2022 in relation to the 88% figure quoted by the Manager of Opposition Business, in which the Vice President, Dr Bruce Willett, agreed government bulk billing figures were misleading and significantly skewed. He said that more patients, including those most disadvantaged, have been struggling to find a bulk billing doctor. Quote, "This 88% figure sounds impressive, however this is misleading and refers to total GP services. Some patients are being bulk billed for parts of their appointment but still paying out-of-pocket costs. On closer inspection," Dr Willett goes on to say, "the proportion of patients who had all their general practice care bulk billed is only 67% nationally." He went on to say government bulk billing figures were also skewed by COVID, Dr Willett said. "GP clinics have administered millions of COVID-19 vaccinations, all of which are bulk billed, and certain patient groups were bulk billed for all telehealth consultations for a large part of 2020. This means that the resulting bulk billing data looks a lot rosier than is actually the case." Thank you, Mr Speaker.
We shall go to papers, and I call the Leader of the House.
Speaker, these documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to the honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.